While many of New York's mobsters have become notorious throughout their nefarious careers, known as formidable adversaries to the law, few of them could claim to be as feared as Roy DeMeo. Of course, the likes of Greg Scarpa and Anthony Casso have gone down in history for their violent personalities and needless personal vendettas, but they aren't known for their signature murder techniques and specialized killing crews. Across Roy DeMeo's life as a member of the Gambino Crime Family, he is believed to have been responsible for as many as 200 murders and wasn't afraid to quite literally get his hands dirty. Many of the notorious DeMeo Crew's victims were killed by Roy himself. On top of this, he bolstered the wealth of his family by taking part in carjackings, running prostitution rackets, and dealing drugs. He was by far one of the most intimidating figures of the Mafia's golden age. In this video, we will be breaking down the life and times of Roy DeMeo, finding out what made him such a formidable gangster. How did he join the mob? What brought about his grisly homicidal habits? What became of him in the end? Join us if you dare, as we come face to face with the Mafia's single most feared hitman of all. A word of warning before we begin. This video will handle a series of sensitive topics pertaining to particularly grisly murders, which may be disturbing to some. Viewer discretion is advised. On the 7th of September 1940, Roy DeMeo was born to Antonio Joseph DeMeo and Eleanor DeMeo. His was a working-class family in the flatlands of Brooklyn, New York City. His father worked as a laundry delivery man, and his mother was a stay-at-home housewife. Roy was the fourth of 5 children in the DeMeo family, and life was not easy. With many mouths to feed on a single salary within an expensive city, the family often fell on hard times. Still, despite the rampant rise of organized crime on the streets of 1940s Brooklyn, Roy's family managed to stay away from the illegal underground. By all means, Roy was never destined to become a mobster, and he even enrolled and graduated from James Madison High School as a teenager. Roy DeMeo's first foray into crime came while he was still enrolled in high school. He saw and took opportunities to become a small-time loan shark, extorting money from the people of Brooklyn where he could. This helped to bring in an additional reserve of money to the DeMeo family, while he worked as an apprentice butcher for a local grocery store throughout his adolescence. By all accounts, things were looking up for the DeMeos. Roy was an educated young man with 2 sources of income, albeit one being high risk and illegal. Everything would change, however, when a hat trick of bad news came their way. In April of 1951, Anthony Frank DeMeo, Roy's older brother and a United States Marine Corps corporal, was killed in action during the Korean War. Aged just 20 years old, the news devastated the DeMeo family, and from here on out, their home lives were not the same. A few years later, in 1960, Antonio Joseph DeMeo, Roy's father, died of a sudden heart attack. His mother, stricken by grief, took Roy's youngest brother and relocated back to her native Naples, Italy. Roy's family was fractured, and this may indeed have been the push he needed to begin a life of organized crime. During the mid-1960s, Roy DeMeo began associating with serious big-time loan sharks, specifically those of the Lucchese crime family, who extorted the companies at New York's docks and junkyards. For a while, he began to perform odd jobs for the Lucchese's as an associate, but would eventually meet Anthony Frank Nino Gaggi in 1966, who at the time was a soldier in the Gambino crime family. Gaggi informed DeMeo that he could make even more money as a Gambino gangster and urged him to switch sides. DeMeo took him up on his offer, and by the end of the 1960s, was bringing in a strong income as an experienced loan shark himself. Around this time, he became close with a number of Gambino family initiates who specialized in violent car theft and gradually became embroiled in a more brutal lifestyle. It was these young gangsters that would come to be known as the DeMeo Crew. the gold standard in violent mafia crime. Steadily, over the course of the late 1960s, Roy DeMeo put together a crack team of young, violent criminals within the Gambino crime family who could help him become even wealthier, even more notorious. The first member of the soon-to-be DeMeo Crew was Harvey Rosenberg, aged just 16 at the time he joined. The two met during a drug deal, and DeMeo subsequently helped Rosenberg increase his profits greatly. The two became good friends and eventually decided to work together on a long-term basis. Rosenberg introduced DeMeo to his own friends, including, but not limited to Joseph Testa, Patrick Testa, Anthony Center, Carlo Profeta, Henry Borelli, and Vito Arena. The newly formed DeMeo Crew started by pursuing loan sharking, car theft, and drug dealing opportunities wherever they could, with loan sharking in particular expanding fast. In 1972, Roy DeMeo became a member of a New York credit union, which allowed him to launder money through new sources. After climbing his way to the board of directors, he began loaning money to dentists, doctors, restaurant owners, and construction companies, managing to stay under the law's radar with his subtle crimes. At this point, DeMeo seems to have started engaging in much more violent affairs. He allegedly disposed of a body for Gambino Crime Family underboss Salvatore Vitale, and became a notorious figure in the underground world of extortion, using his growing crew and aggressive demeanor to bring in immense sums of money for himself and the Gambino crime family. Towards the end of 1974, DeMeo committed his first on-record murder, alongside the now infamous DeMeo Crew. The victim was Andre Katz, an auto repair shop owner in his 20s who had previously helped Roy and his crew steal cars for the mob. Soon, however, what would become a terrifying vendetta against Katz was formed when the young mechanic reported Harvey Rosenberg to the police, informing them of his involvement with a car theft ring. Using corrupt contacts he had recently amassed within the New York Police Department, DeMeo caught wind of Katz's betrayal and began plotting on how to ensure he would never double-cross the Gambinos again. DeMeo's plan involved enlisting the help of Babette Judith Questel, offering her money in exchange for her role in attracting Katz for what he thought would be a date. On the 13th of June, 1975, the trap was set, just after Katz had begun testifying in court against the DeMeo Crew. Questel had previously met with Katz and had built up trust, luring him into a false sense of security and inviting him to her apartment for a date. Katz arrived that night, where he was immediately apprehended by several members of the DeMeo Crew, including Roy himself. The gangsters bundled him in the back of a car and drove him to the butcher's room of a supermarket in Queens, New York, where he was promptly executed with several butcher knife stab wounds to the heart and back. The DeMeo Crew weren't done yet, though. Roy cut off his victim's head and ran it through a compacting machine, rendering it unrecognizable. Katz's body was further decapitated, and the individual pieces were deposited in the bins outside of the supermarket in which he was killed. Several days later, a dog walker discovered one of Katz's legs, which had fallen out of the bin, and reported it to the police. Katz was identified by dental records, but the DeMeo Crew were not apprehended for their crime. Over time, the DeMeo Crew became increasingly involved in the most heinous of crimes, murder. Terrifyingly, they became extremely good at it, and eventually became an infamous, specialized group within the Gambino crime family that primarily carried out murders, using their own trademark modus operandi, the Gemini method. The Gemini method was reserved for victims whom DeMeo wished to disappear quickly. Any murders that were carried out to send a message were dealt with in different ways. The Gemini method got its name from the Gemini Lounge, where the DeMeo Crew tended to favor as a meeting spot, and also served as the last place many of their victims were seen alive. But what did this particularly grisly method involve? The Gemini method was a favorite execution style carried out by the DeMeo Crew in the 1970s and early 1980s, and involved, first and foremost, luring the victim through the side door of the Gemini Lounge before leading them through to an apartment towards the back of the building. As soon as the victim was in the apartment with the door closed, DeMeo himself would shoot the target at point-blank range in the head, covering the wound with a towel to limit the blood flow. At this point, another member, usually Rosenberg, would stab the victim right in the heart to prevent blood from flowing quickly out of the bullet wound. Once the intense bleeding had been temporarily mitigated, the mobsters would remove all of the victim's clothing and drain any additional blood into a bathtub in the next room. By this point, most of the victim's blood had either been released down the drain or had congealed within the body. Now, the gangsters were ready for the next step: dismemberment. The members of the DeMeo crew involved in the murder would proceed to sever the head, arms, and legs of their victim, while they were laid out on a plastic sheet in the apartment's main room. Each body part would then be wrapped in plastic bags within cardboard boxes and were driven to TW Fountain Avenue landfill, one of the largest waste disposal areas in New York. The size of the landfill made it extremely difficult for authorities to even discover the bodies of the DeMeo crew's victims, let alone pin the crime on Roy and his men. Many of the details of the Gemini method were revealed to the police in a series of interviews with DeMeo crew members who became FBI informants and witnesses in the days following the disbanding of the group. While, in the early 1980s, several members of the DeMeo crew became wanted for murder, the police abandoned their efforts to uncover the bodies at the Fountain Avenue landfill due to the size of the site, which has since been replaced by a park. Many of the DeMeo crew's victims remain anonymous to this day, and only a select few have been identified or named. Many of their targets were mobsters who had an execution order issued by high-ranking members of the mob, such as Joseph Brocchini. Brocchini was a Lucchese crime family gangster whose murder was issued by none other than Anthony Gaggi, DeMeo's close friend and, at the time, capo regime. He was killed as an act of revenge after Brocchini gave DeMeo a black eye in a brawl in 1976, but, interestingly, was not dispatched using the Gemini method. Rather, he was shot 5 times in the head while he visited his used car dealership in Queens, New York, and the DeMeo crew made it look like a botched armed robbery attempt. Another victim of the DeMeo crew, the disgraced Michael DiCarlo, was murdered for his illicit relationship with an underage boy. The gangsters allegedly took turns shooting, stabbing, and beating him to death with a hammer before dismembering him in the classic Gemini fashion. Many other gangsters were executed by DeMeo and his crew after they were due to testify against the Gambino Crime Family. These victims include James Bennett, Patrick Penny, Joseph Coppolino, and Peter Waring, all of whom were suspected informants who had sought out the protection of the FBI. Others represented the culmination of personal vendettas. Gary Gardine, for example, was murdered by the DeMeo crew after he failed to pay Rosenberg back after a marijuana deal. He was shot, and his body was stuffed into the boot of a burned-out car. Others, such as Patrick Presenzano, met particularly grisly fates. This Bonanno crime family associate was killed in the March of 1978 after refusing to return stolen jewelry from one of DeMeo's associates. The DeMeo crew kidnapped him, beat him up, and slit his throat from ear to ear. Murder soon became big business for DeMeo and his men, and he acted as a formidable hitman who would take on bounties brought to him by his associates. Those who wished somebody dead would come to DeMeo and pay him for his services as, essentially, a skilled assassin. Assault perpetrators, child predators, and treacherous gangsters were all brought to the Gemini Lounge as a result. Throughout the latter half of the 1970s, DeMeo continued to rise in the world of organized crime, and not all of it was as calculated and glamorous as carjacking, loan sharking, and murder. In 1975, he became involved in the adult entertainment industry, overtaking a pornography racket in Bricktown, New Jersey, but eventually turned his attention to taboo, illegal genres. Gaggi, DeMeo's mentor and capo regime, ordered Roy to stop producing such content and threatened to take his life if he continued. Nonetheless, DeMeo continued to pursue this particularly vile source of income, and Gaggi did not come through with his threat of murder. Over time, Gaggi and DeMeo's relationship began to break up, but DeMeo continued supplying his former ally with money. By the end of 1975, the IRS had begun to investigate DeMeo's sources of income, suspecting nefarious activity. Around the same time, the credit union he had joined towards the start of his criminal career had entered a state of insolvency, as DeMeo continued to take money from it to fund his illegal businesses. Just as the mobster was about to be indicted for his crimes, he produced a false affidavit from the legitimate businesses he worked with, claiming that he was an employee on the standard company payroll. The IRS, as well as the wider law, were off his back, and it was back to illegal business as usual for DeMeo. Over the late 1970s, his wealth would continue to grow as he established a new hijacking racket, stealing trucks bound for John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York City. By all means, at this point, he was seemingly untouchable. The DeMeo crew were continuing to trade in blood, and Roy himself had his hands in almost every shady pot of gold the city had to offer. It's important to remember, however, that at this point, DeMeo was not a made man in the Mafia. But was that about to change? Things were shaken up when Carlo Gambino, the boss of the Gambino Crime Family, passed away in the autumn of 1976. His successor was chosen to be Paul Castellano, with Agnello Della Croce serving as his underboss. Gaggi would be made a capo regime around this time, effectively filling Castellano's old position. And for a while, this worked in DeMeo's favor. New gangsters could now find their way into the ranks, any of whom could potentially serve as new members for the DeMeo Crew. Castellano did not see things the same way, however. He decided to promote gangsters internally rather than recruit new ones, and still refused to turn DeMeo into a made man. He believed that DeMeo was a wild, uncontrollable individual who, with additional power, could become increasingly dangerous. In the late 1970s, when news of Castellano's decision reached him, DeMeo became furious and began searching for new ways of proving himself in the mob. This would, in time, pay off. In 1977, disgruntled by his boss's choice to refuse his ascension to maid status, Roy DeMeo set to work on proving himself. He developed an alliance with the Westies, an Irish-American gang based in Hell's Kitchen, and worked with them to secure control of the entire west side of Manhattan. Revenue from this filtered back to Castellano, who was indeed growing fond of DeMeo by this point. DeMeo got back in touch with Gaggi and persuaded him to formally recognize the alliance he had forged, and Castellano subsequently met with their new Irish-American allies, formally inducting them as an arm of the Gambino Crime Family. By this point, Castellano was pleased enough with DeMeo's work to officially induct him as a made man, and the ceremony to do so took place in the summer of 1977. As well as the DeMeo Crew, he was now in charge of the Westies' dealings in Manhattan, and increased the mob's revenue even further up to the turn of the 1980s. DeMeo was made an official member of the Gambino Crime Family on the condition that he would not commit any additional murders without Castellano's permission, and that he would refrain from dealing drugs. Despite these rules, DeMeo continued to commit unsanctioned killings and moved a massive quantity of pills, marijuana, and cocaine across New York in the late 1970s. Surprisingly, some of the murders he carried out at this point in his career were internal. He began picking off members of the DeMeo Crew, starting with Edward Grillo, a hijacker who worked on his racket at JFK Airport. Grillo had racked up a high amount of debt with DeMeo, debt that he could not pay off, and so, in 1978, he met the brutality of the Gemini method. In 1979, DeMeo committed a murder that would act as an early warning sign for the end of his criminal career. An increasingly paranoid DeMeo had recently been sent news that Rosenberg had orchestrated a drug deal with Cuban cartel members in Florida. But when the deal was completed, Rosenberg murdered the Cuban and his associates in cold blood. While DeMeo contemplated his next move, he was constantly looking over his shoulder, believing assassins would be sent his way as an act of retribution. One afternoon, He believed he had his sights on one. A young man he didn't recognize was parked outside of his house in Massapequa Park, Long Island, and DeMeo suspected he was being watched. He and his fellow crew members, Joseph Guglielmo and Frederick Denome, jumped in DeMeo's car and tailed this unknown suspect for 7 miles through Amityville and Farmingdale, and shot him to death in a remote, yet still alarmingly public location. Believing that the Cuban cartels were imminently coming to kill him, DeMeo collected his family and put them up in a hotel in upstate New York. For 2 weeks, nothing happened, and nobody came for either DeMeo or his family. Something was wrong. It soon came to light that the man DeMeo had killed was not an assassin. He wasn't from Cuba, nor did he have any criminal connections. His name was Dominic Ragucci, a college student based in New York City who was working part-time as a door-to-door salesman to fund his tuition. He had just happened to be working on DeMeo's street that day when the paranoid gangster began to tail him down the highway to his doom. DeMeo, who was famously a stoic man who rarely showed emotion, reportedly broke down in tears when he realized he had killed an innocent young man and refused to eat for several days. From this point onwards, DeMeo's family began to view him in a different light. Prior to this brutal mishap, they had remained mostly unaware of his crimes, but this was too much to ignore. When Gaggy received the news of an innocent man's death by DeMeo's hand, he was outraged. He ordered DeMeo to carry out Rosenberg's death before any more innocent people were killed. Rosenberg had no idea he was about to be killed as he entered the Gemini Lounge on the night of the 11th of May, 1979, when DeMeo fired a single shot into the side of his head. The bullet didn't kill him straight away. A distressed DeMeo looked on in horror as Rosenberg attempted to rise to one knee, before Anthony Center unloaded another 4 shots into his skull. To appease the Cuban cartels, Castellano agreed that Rosenberg's body should not be disposed of using the normal Gemini method. Instead, the Cubans requested that Castellano's men left his body where it would be discovered. Rosenberg was positioned in his car by the side of the road, running to the Gateway National Wildlife Refuge, and was discovered by police shortly after. This murder affected DeMeo badly, and he entered a deep depression following Rosenberg's death. He sequestered himself in a safe house near Times Square with Guglielmo for 6 weeks following the operation, where he grew a full beard and disguised himself with a cap and sunglasses whenever he went out in public. Never in his career had Mafia life been so tumultuous, and he became increasingly paranoid that his actions would soon come back to bite him. Then, later in 1979, disaster struck again. 2 Gambino Crime Family members, James Ippolito and James Ippolito Jr., the respective uncle and cousin of corrupt NYPD detective and mob ally Louis Ippolito, had grown resentful of Gaggy and DeMeo. Ippolito Sr. had informed Castellano about DeMeo and Gaggy's persistent drug-dealing operations, which defied the rules of the Gambino crime family. Much to DeMeo's benefit, Castellano sided with Gaggy, and DeMeo, with his capo regime in tow, swiftly killed both Ippolitos. There was a problem, however. A witness had identified Gaggy as the murders were carried out, and he was subsequently arrested after a brief shootout with the police. Gaggy was soon facing murder charges, but only received a 5 to 15-year sentence after he tampered with the jury. DeMeo murdered the witnesses to the murders of the Ippolitos, but Gaggy, a key Gambino capo regime, was now locked up. As Gaggy was sent down, it became increasingly obvious to law enforcement that DeMeo was a close ally of his. Over the years, hundreds of missing persons cases had been linked to DeMeo's whereabouts, but due to his skilled crew, there was never enough evidence to pin any of them on him. It was starting to feel like it was just a matter of time before the law caught up with the DeMeo crew. In 1982, Vito Arena, a former ally of DeMeo, had begun working with a federal task force to bring down Gambino crime family members, and his attention had been turned to DeMeo himself. DeMeo immediately went into hiding, fearing an imminent indictment, emerging only to meet with lawyers. By this point, he fully believed that the end was nigh. Castellano caught wind of this chain of events and started to worry. He also believed that it was just a matter of time before DeMeo was arrested, and he feared that given Arena's treachery, his prize hitman may turn informant too, if presented with the option. Castellano began to conspire to end DeMeo's life, but struggled to find somebody capable and willing to pull the trigger on such a formidable gangster. A few potential hitmen were considered, including Gene Gotti, a brother of the infamous John Gotti, as well as Frank DeCicco, the eventual underboss of the Gambino crime family. Neither were up to the task, and so Castellano offered the job to DeMeo's own men. By this point in his life, DeMeo was a shadow of his former self. He had become extremely anxious that he would either be arrested or killed, and had cut ties with Castellano, figuring that he would be hot on his trail. According to DeMeo's son Albert, he would spend all his time wearing a leather jacket with a sawed-off shotgun concealed within. He even considered faking his own death to give himself a little time to escape, but this never came to fruition. Then, on the 10th of January, 1983, DeMeo went missing. His last known location was the house of Patty Testa, one of his DeMeo Crew associates, and his family had become nervous when he didn't show up for his daughter's birthday party. 10 days later, after the family cautiously awaited news, DeMeo's Cadillac was discovered, parked outside the Varuna Boat Club in Sheepshead Bay, Brooklyn. Officers towed it to the nearby police station, where upon cracking open the boot, DeMeo's body was discovered. Partially frozen, with a chandelier placed on top of his corpse, his head was riddled with several bullet holes. Another wound could be found on his hand, presumably in an attempt to defend himself as his murderers opened fire. Sure enough, Castellano's plan to have DeMeo executed had been carried out. The men DeMeo once called allies had set him up in a similar manner to the way he set up Rosenberg, and he met the same fate. In fact, he was killed the very night he showed up at Testa's house. Reportedly, Testa had offered him a coffee, at which point several of his associates had entered the room and began to shoot. Castellano wouldn't last long after DeMeo's death. By the end of 1985, he had been killed in a conspiracy spearheaded by John Gotti and Frank DeCicco. They feared DeMeo so much that they reportedly were too afraid to make an attempt on Castellano's life while his infamous hitman was still in the picture. DeMeo's murder would indeed be pinned on several members of the DeMeo Crew in the March of 1986, with Henry Borelli taking the brunt of the blame. 3 years later, 9 additional gangsters, including none other than Anthony Center and Joseph Testa, were convicted, given hefty life sentences for their role in not only DeMeo's murder, but the Gambino crime family as a whole. Throughout his life, DeMeo was one of the most brutal and reprehensible mob hitmen that New York City had ever seen. Feared not only by his victims, but often by his fellow mobsters, few outsiders who entered the Gemini Lounge left to tell the tale, and he imprinted a deep, lasting scar on the world of organized crime in his wake. Following his death, many works, including movies, books, and television shows, have attempted to paint the picture of DeMeo's brutal life and times, but perhaps prosecutor William Mack Jr. said it best, following the gangster's death. The Roy DeMeo Crew is the most violent crew ever prosecuted in federal court. As far as my knowledge, DeMeo engaged in wholesale slaughter. DeMeo may be gone, but his presence looms like a black cloud over the streets of New York City today. His crimes affected countless individuals, and he has gone down as one of the most terrifying criminal figures in American history as a result. Few have lived up to his reputation, and it's not hard to see why.